It's great to be back. Thank you all for inviting me. It's always a privilege to be here, a pleasure. One of the great pleasures, of course, is to be able to talk about something like this. There are a number of things in the Brundage collection that are you can say the. So this still remains, after all this time, the earliest Buddha with a date from China. It actually has a date on it. That's it's the one, the piece. It's the piece that Emily Sano used to say, well, if there was a fire in this building, knock on wood, no fires in the building, but if there's a fire in the building and it was going to burn down, this is the piece that she would grab and run out of the building with, the one piece. So it's a marvelous piece to talk about. It sets all kinds of standards. It's at a critical point in Chinese art, and that's how I'm going to talk about it a little bit. But first I want to talk about the sculpture itself. Sometimes we get so caught up in its history and where it fits in the overall Chinese art history that we forget that it's quite a wonderful object in and of itself. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how it was made, the casting technology, which is interesting because I think I've talked to some of you about this before. It's a surprise about how it was made. It's not what we would have thought. I'm also going to talk about a little bit where it fits in the evolving approach to the human figure in Chinese art. Back when I was taking classes, a long, long time ago, it was thought that the human figure really didn't become important in Chinese art until the advent of Buddhism. Well, that's not entirely true, but there's a critical point in this piece as the human figure becomes more important and the divine human figure becomes more important in Chinese art. And then if we have time, one of the great things about this piece is we can actually identify it with certain personalities, real living people in Chinese history. So I will talk a little bit about the history of the time. This is one that David Buchanan says drives him nuts because I go through all these names and all these little countries, and there are a lot of them. But history is never simple. And sometimes just getting into the facts of how this stuff works is very fascinating. Even if there's a lot of names, a lot of dates, and a lot of technical stuff, we can actually tie this piece down to two pretty important historical figures. So I'll try to do a little bit of that towards the end of the lecture. Let's start off talking about the piece itself. We all know the mood is wrong, correct? The hands are in a position that doesn't make sense from Indian Buddhism at the time. And we'll probably talk about a little bit about why that might be the case as we go along. He kind of sits there, eyes slightly downcast, quiet, rather meditative. Matter of fact, he's a meditating Buddha, Dhyana Buddha. And there's a reason for that. That actually gets tied into one of the personalities he can be associated with. We'll talk about that a little later. There he is, those wonderful almond-shaped eyes. So he's gilt bronze all over. So gilt except for the head. The head was not gilt and was probably blue. Those fine lines, striations. It was probably had a turquoise blue color. That seems to have been the standard for that time and all the way through Chinese history for Buddhist sculpture of this type. You can see on the front there are a series of holes, and I'll talk about that again a little bit later. He's on a square base, which is broken, but on the back of that square base there is an inscription. So the base itself is decorated all the way around. If you look at it very closely, you'll see these really wonderful fine line plant motifs. Susan Bush writes about those if you want to know more about those. I find it interesting if you look at the corners, there's evidence of what it looks like to be mitered, right? As if there was a mitered corner there. Well, that's not a structural thing, that's a decorative thing. There's no structure that means it should be mitered. So it leads me to speculate maybe that it's copying something. Maybe there's some other pieces were being made at the time out of wood. Now that's pure speculation, you're not supposed to do that, but there it is, it's got a mitered corner, right? And that's true of all the corners all the way around. So one wonders if there isn't some kind of a looking at another material, looking at wood. So again, we have these holes where things probably were mounted on the front, and then this wonderful scroll patterning around. There's nothing going on in here, so one can think that that was probably had something in front of it that covered it up. All right, have I done something wrong here? There we go. He's kind of gently leaning forward. This is actually two views. This is not the Buddha in conversation with himself, but maybe he does that as well. He has this little tang on the back of his head, which has a hole through the middle of it, and that's important in his overall iconography, I believe. You can see that those panels, again, little mitered corners, little blank panels on the sides, kind of sitting, gently leaning forward, looking down. So again, a meditating Buddha. And here he is from the back, and here's that marvelous, here's the inscription that is so important. And you can see it broke, and I'll speculate a little later about why it broke, but it broke right here. But it broke in a very nice way that it saved the date. The date is right there. From here I can see 8th month, but you can see the cyclical date, and the date is right there. So that is the date 338. So nice that it broke. If it was going to break, that it broke where it did. He's rather not quite as completely finished or elaborately decorated on the back. The garment patterns are rather simple and shallow. And again, I think there were things behind him that would have made that less important as a decorative element. This is a shot you don't get to see very often, but this is a shot on the inside. So he's hollow, those of you who don't know that. He's not as heavy as you might think because he is hollow and not particularly thickly cast. You can get a sense of the thickness of the bronze right here. We'll come back to this slide again a little while later. This is obviously the front with the 3 holes coming through where I'm going to speculate things were attached. And then he's hollow all the way up into the inside. He's one of a group of similar pieces. He's the only one that has an inscribed date, and he's by far and away the largest of the group. This is another one in the Asian Art Museum's collection. This is, for those of you who are interested, 1992.25. It was given by the Weiss family in loving memory of Hans and Gretel Popper. They were important here for years past. So this was given in 1992. So it's, as you can see, has the same incorrect hand gesture, same mudra, the same kind of slightly leaning forward, the same meditating type of Buddha, seated on a stand. One can guess perhaps that some of these motifs would have been what would have been attached on the front of this piece. And actually there are quite a number of these. Here are 2 that have been excavated in China. This one from Gansu province and this one from Hebei. And these pieces were probably made in Hebei province. So this is up in northern China, northeastern China a little bit. And this is where the capital of the state that this is pieces to be associated with. That's where it was located, and our Chinese specialists working in China now figure there was a big foundry there making bronze sculptures of this type that would have gone all over China. So this being in Hebei province. This is the most complete of the type, and you can see all kinds of things were attached onto this figure. I think the most important thing as we look at the 338 Buddha, or one of the more interesting things, is the staff with the parasol on the top. Of course, that has iconography, Buddhist iconography, and is typical of this whole group. I think many of them had that kind of thing on them, including the 338. And then we have a pair of lions and often a lotus-type motif in the middle. So if we look at the 338, that's how I think he would have looked originally. I think he would have had, going through this tang in the back, which is hollow in the center, and going down and attaching to the base in the back, would have been a shaft like this one, and then on the top would have been an umbrella, quite a big umbrella, I think on a piece of this scale. These holes on this one, these would have been little dangly things. You see them in Korean art, you see them in some kinds of Chinese art in the northern parts. It would have little dangles hanging from it. And then on the front, attached to those 3 holes in the front, would have been a pair of lions, and often it's a lotus-type motif in the middle. So one of these days, I want to get somebody to do a computer-generated image for me, and we're going to get this piece as it was in its original form with all those little bits on there. But you can kind of get an idea. There was more to it than there is now, although it is remarkably complete for its age. All right, casting technology. So how many of you know how this piece was cast? How many of you have listened to me in the past? We can go, yeah, okay, everybody, we'll skip through this. We'll skip this part then. All right. No, there are a few people who haven't heard this, so the rest of you will have to suffer through it with me. It has something to do, with the importance of bronze in Chinese culture. The material itself was important. It had sacred powers, or had sacred powers associated with it in the early Bronze Age in China. And bronze was by and large used to cast objects of status, so things that were used in the ritual cultures, weapons that were meant to maintain status, But these are basically objects that were made for the use of in the ancestor worship of the time. We all know that, correct? Everybody knows that? Well, that had, of course, a direct impact on the nature of the art that was being cast, because you don't cast a human figure if you're casting a vessel. You cast a vessel, you decorate the surface of the vessel. So human sculpture is going to be quite rare in Chinese art, mainstream Chinese art, during the early parts of Chinese history, because they're focusing on making vessels. The bronze was being used by and large for objects that were used in rituals, or objects that were used for weapons, objects that were used to maintain status. So here's that kind of standard range of bronze vessels that we all are familiar with. You know, this comes from the Great Bronze Age of China. I've been using this slide for a long, long time. I probably should get a new one somewhere, but it works quite well. The process was to make a model in clay of the piece, and then to take wet clay and press it around the outside, and you make a mold out of that. Take it apart. You carve down that original model to the thickness of the walls that you want. Then you reassemble those outer sections, these mold sections, over that, and you cast the bronze into that. Now, to keep the interior, the core, separated from the outer sections, the mold, you actually use chaplets, little spacers. So as you put this back together, after you've carved this down and put it in, it becomes the core, and you put it back together, you have to have something to keep the thickness of the bronze has to be determined by little spacers. They're called chaplets. So those become kind of important because when you look at them, that's what we see. This is a piece in the collection that's been x-rayed. This is an x-ray of the lid. And if you see a lot of these little things like this, those are the chaplets. They're a different material, or they end up showing up differently in the bronze when you take an x-ray of it, because they were either a different kind of bronze. Obviously, they were pre-existing, and the bronze was cast around them. So if you look at the x-rays of these pieces, and you see the little chaplets like that, and actually if you look at the interiors of many bronze vessels, you can see them on the surface of the vessel. You can see that little piece of different kind of metal. You start looking for them. That's a pretty good indication that this piece, or pieces like this, were being made in the piece mold rather than the lost wax technique. So nowadays, connoisseurs, of course, look at their bronzes very carefully, and they start looking for evidence of chaplets. That's been going on for quite a while, since it's been understood that this is an indication that the piece was cast in the traditional means. There were great fakes made in years past, and there are great fakes made now. But if you find fakes that have no chaplets, then if you find a piece that has no chaplets, you probably got a fake or you got a problem. If you find a piece that has chaplets, well, it's probably a newer fake. You never know. You never know. Anyway, and that type of casting technology continued long after the ritual vessels had become passé, and the art forms were evolving. These are some pieces that are in a local private collection, a pair of horses and a chariot, probably from Gansu province. These are from the Eastern Han Dynasty, so sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. This is a marvelous big horse, 52 inches high. Again, these were cast in the same piece mold technology. The technology worked, there was no need to change, so they didn't change over to lost wax technology to create these, and we know that they were made in piece mold technology because they're the chaplets. You can see them setting quite clearly in the bronze. So as we studied this, and we did some x-rays of these figures, you can see that the same technology was being continued. You have an issue, of course, if you have a huge established business of any kind, if you have a big business of some sort, a technology that is established, changing technologies because you have a change in your market is a little bit difficult. To throw away all that old equipment, all that old stuff, learn it all over again. You're not likely to do that unless there's a real impetus to do such. And that impetus had not yet arrived in China. There was no need to change over to anything else. They could still continue to use this piece mold technology. And that continues to be true up into the creation of the 338 Buddha. That slide's a little out of focus, but I think if you look real hard, you can see a chaplet there. This is right in this area right here. There's a chaplet. There's another one up in here. This was definitely made in the piece mold, using the piece mold technique. So in years past, and certainly when I was studying this kind of thing, it would have been common to have said that the Buddhist figure came from India, from South Asia, And with it came the lost wax casting technology. So it was always assumed by me and by, I think, many others that this piece was cast in the lost wax technology. It was not. Clearly it was not. And in fact, most of the Buddhist pieces made in this early date were not. They were cast in the piece mold technology. That does not mean the Chinese were not aware of lost wax technology. They did use it. They used it in very specific pieces or types of pieces where the piece mold technology would not work. But in this case, the existing technologies worked. Why change to something else? So they continued to use this technology. Danostrayan, who was here as our head of conservation labs, and then went to the Met and is now the head of the labs at the Freer Sackler, did a study on Buddhist sculptures at the Met and on this piece and a number of others. And she came to the conclusion that this piece mold technology continued to be common in Buddhist sculpture, Chinese Buddhist sculpture, probably through the end of the 4th and into the early 5th century. And then you start to see lost wax getting more and more prevalent, and shortly after the 5th century, as you get into the Northern Way, great sculptures of that later period, then by and large, lost wax is the technology of preference. So the technology changed, the industry changed over that period of time. Is that fairly clear, fairly straightforward? And you can see, there's no doubt, that's a chaplet. There's no other reason for that to be there. Okay, docents, what is another sign of piece mold technology? Okay, so what happens when you have pieces that you want to put together in a mold? Certain pieces were cast first, and they were fit into the mold, and then the bronze was cast over them, or the other way around. You cast the piece and you put a mold onto the piece, and that's how you made your appendages, right? So if you look at pieces and you see something like this, well, that's not a solder line. That's pretty clear indication, at least to me, that this piece was cast first, it was inserted into the mold, and then this piece was cast over it. So again, there's another indication that this was done in the piece mold technology, using the existing technologies, that this bit was first cast, and then this was cast over. You can see the edge. There's no evidence of this being a solder line or of the bronze going one way or the other. This one would have been cast first and fit into the mold because the bronze comes over it, right? So the little pieces that were on the base and probably the other pieces were cast first. They were inserted into the mold, and then the body of the Buddha was cast over it. So this is some new stuff for me. I had fun digging around, looking at this, trying to figure out, okay, how was this piece put together in the casting process? And you get a pretty good idea, but I think this gives some evidence of how the various pieces were fit together as it was cast into a single piece. And again, you can see those 3 holes come through, and that was very much for things being attached. I don't know that those were actually cast. It looks to me like they were cut through at a later date. You can kind of see they were cut through after the piece had been cast. They were drilled through, and then the pieces were attached to them. But that basic idea of creating a model in clay and then building the core out, cutting the core out of that, well, there's his knees, and there's where his hands come in. Almost all of those elements of the outer part of the Buddha are reflected on the inside as well. They're quite clearly there, up into his head. Okay. The human figure in Chinese art. Now, in early Chinese art, and this is one that requires much more time than I have today, and one that is a fascinating subject. For those of you who want further information, I can start you with a specialist that many of us know, Lai Guolong, use of the human figure in early Chinese art. This is in selected articles from orientations. It's in the reading list. He's done an interesting study. Other people have done as well. And there is that kind of basic idea that if you're creating vessels, you don't create sculptures. Then that's the case with early Chinese art. That's one of the reasons that the rhino is so exceptional, so wonderful, is that it takes the form of an animal. That it is very sculptural in form. By and large, when you're creating a vessel that has a particular function, and each one of these vessels did have a particular function in the ritual ceremonies of the time, you create the vessel and then you decorate the surface. So the surface in most of these early bronzes, as we all know, is made up of these kind of mythical, magical, wonderful animals, the Kuei Long, the Tao Tie, and so on. But they're not really sculptural, and the human figure is quite rare. That has to do probably with the kind of religious practices of the time and the religious beliefs of the time, the ultimate deity was Tian, was heaven. Not a man-like God at all, not a God in the shape of a man, but heaven, just kind of an amorphous, wonderful, huge power. And that's an important part, plays a huge role in Chinese art, but doesn't really show up. I mean, how do you represent heaven? Not in a sculptural form anyway, it doesn't happen. So the human figure is quite rare in Shang Dynasty arts and Zhou Dynasty arts, unless you find it sometimes in smaller figures, in these jades from the Fuhao tomb. So these are Shang Dynasty. So there's a caution for everybody, including me and everybody else who works in any field. As soon as you make a categorical statement, the human figure was rare in Chinese art, the Shang Dynasty, somebody's going to say, well, look at these. What do you think about these? So these are figures that have a specific purpose, a shaman-type figure. People often say male and female, often reverse sides, and this a kind of kneeling servant figure or subservient figure of some sort. And of course, if you get outside of mainstream Chinese art, and you get into the Sanqing Dui things like this, well, the human figure is all over the place. I would argue that these pieces are not really, they're Chinese in the sense of this is politically and culturally now China, but this was not Shang China. This was something entirely different. This was a different culture with different religious practices and different uses of the bronzes in those practices and in the arts of the time. So this is really outside the mainstream of Chinese art. It's its own tradition, its own culture. They're really wonderful. Remember this guy from the golden age of Chinese archaeology came here? Really quite remarkable. Actually, I think this one did as well. And you find them, again, you find the human figure in peripheral cultures that had their own traditions. Peripheral is probably not the right term. Traditions that had their own, cultures that had their own traditions that were on the sidelines around China and now have been brought into the cultural and political entity that is China, but they were not of that same culture at this earlier period. Is that clear? Am I making sense here? Am I losing everybody? Everybody's okay with that? In other words, if we're looking at Shang China, we're looking at a relatively small geographical area. That China now covers a much larger area, and so we call these things Chinese art, and they are in the modern sense of China. But in the cultures of the time, these were distinct cultures. They were not part of the Shang cultural sphere. As you get into the Warring States period, as you get later in the Bronze Age, figures begin to show up, and there are actually quite a number of fairly remarkable sculptures of the human figure. I apologize for the quality of these slides. But this is the Leguduan Zhenghe Yi tomb. So this is 433 BCE. This is in the Hubei Provincial Museum. And they're quite marvelous figures here. Look at these figures. These are military figures cast in bronze, and they're quite big. They're as big as this, and quite well represented. I mean, the human figure, the nature of the clothing, the weapons, everything is there. Of course, they're still in the subsidiary position. They're holding up these chimes. But there's a clear indication that there was no problem with representing the human figure. They were capable of doing this. It was just a matter of cultural choice and religious practice. Here they are, again, quite marvelous, supporting these, and there are numbers of them. And they show up not only in this set of bell chimes, but the second set of bell chimes from the same tomb site, or the same burial site, and other figures of the time. And they also show up, of course, the human figure shows up in decoration at the Spring and Autumn Warring States. In inlaid pieces, we have one upstairs. But you see these figures, again, often military figures, not so often religious figures, but often military figures or figures involved in some kinds of rites and rituals. So they're actually doing the rites and rituals in which those vessels would have been used. You see the bells being played here and the food vessels being used. They're being represented in a pictorial sense on the surface decoration of these ritual vessels of the time. Something new does begin to show up at this time, and again, all of these are in a local private collection, and these are interesting because these two figures in particular, we begin to see the introduction of and the use of known religious figures. Figures that are actually, these are the figures that people now are trying to figure out, who are they? What's the iconography? Because these were cast with no secondary purpose. These were cast as figures. These were cast as sculptures, human sculptures, or sculptural forms. That guy's not really human, is he? So the theory is that this is Lei Zi and Shengnong. So these are deities of the period, and from historical times. They're quite different than this. Of course, there's another human figure from about the same time, but that's a lampstand, so that's a subsidiary figure. That would have been holding a candle. But these pieces are probably sculptures, and are sculptures of religious figures. So as we get into this kind of later part of the Bronze Age, somewhere in the 4th century maybe a little bit earlier, we begin to see the representation in sculptural form of religious figures, and that's going to continue. So that whole thing about the religious figure in Chinese art coming with the advent of Buddhism is not correct. These are religious figures being cast as sculptural forms in quite a bit before the advent of Buddhism in China. And of course, when we get to the first emperor's tomb, these marvelous pieces, they were making quite remarkable human sculptures by that time. I remember reading the catalog, and in one of the essays in the catalog, there's a legend, and maybe not such a legend now, maybe it was actually a fact, that the first emperor collected the bronzes, weapons, and such from all of the cultures around, all the areas around him, and had them cast into 9 gigantic human figures. Well, he certainly had the capability. When we saw those marvelous birds and other things that came out of the tomb site, and we see these ceramic sculptures, by this time, the observation of the human figure, the creation of the human figure, and other sculptural types in Chinese art was fairly common and fairly successful, quite closely observed. Really good, aren't they? I mean, they really are good representations of these the figures and then so on. Are quite remarkably well done. So the ability to do in sculptural form, horses, chariots, the human figure was certainly there. There's no indication, I haven't seen any x-rays of these pieces, but there's no indication that these were not cast in the piece mold, the piece mold technology. There's no indication that lost wax was being used here. Again, the technology's continued through this, but I would like to see x-rays of these one of these days just to see how they were done. But I would guess that these were done in the piece mold technology. Those technologies continued on for a number of centuries after this. And then when you get into Han art, the art of the Han Dynasty, you see bronzes in a variety of forms, sculptural bronzes like this marvelous piece. It's a lamp, figure holding up an incense burner. These again are more subsidiary figures, but the powers of the observation of the human figure are improving, increasing, and the figure is getting more important and more commonly found in the arts of this time. So there's an interest in human figures, in kind of support figures or subsidiary figures, servants like the lampstand, support figures like the little boy holding up the Boishanlu. And we also begin to get these kind of spiritual beings. We may not be able to identify exactly what spirits they are. This one from the Nanyue tomb, this is a support for probably a screen of some sort, but you see this very strange looking human-like figure down here. And then these winged creatures showing up in increasing numbers in Han Dynasty arts. Where else will you see these winged figures? Somebody, I heard that. Very good. So I'm done. You can take over for the lecture from now. Let's find out. So we see them in mirrors. We see them, of course, in the money tree. But as you get into the Han Dynasty, as you go into the Eastern Han, but certainly later Western Han and Eastern Han, you begin to see religious figures more and more commonly represented in the arts of the time. Here we're going to see the Queen Mother of the West, Shi Wangmu. She's going to show up quite a bit. So here's a religious figure being clearly portrayed, often with an entourage. There are historical figures portrayed on the backs of these mirrors. Again, this is surface decoration on the backs of the mirrors. I don't have a full indication or full idea how these things might have been represented in other situations. But here they are becoming quite common. So you get Shi Wangmu, Dong Wangfu, that whole kind, and then a whole series of other kinds of figures, either real, historical, or the religious figures showing up on these mirrors. And they do show up on the money tree. Both these winged figures running up and down the sides. And this is where Buddhist figures also, the figures of a Buddha-like figure, begins to show up in Chinese art. This guy comes from right up in here, right? So here he is. A little bit of a cautionary about our money tree. These pieces are all of the same period, but they may not always have been together. They may not have been created as a single piece. There's a possibility that this particular section does not belong to this tree. It's hard to say, hard to prove one way or another. But I've had a number of specialists come in and say, no, when you find a Buddha on a money tree, it's not like this one. But nevertheless, this is a Buddha-like figure of the period, and we see it showing up in a iconography that is associated with the Queen Mother of the West, which makes sense as Buddhism comes into China, that the Buddhist figure coming from the West, the Buddhist iconography and religion coming from the West, would be included in the paradise of the Queen Mother of the West. I have been cautioned by a number of experts that this is not, you shouldn't say that this is the Buddha, that this is a Buddha-like figure. There's a little bit, that's a play on words. But as these show up, it's not that it's that the Chinese fully understood what this figure meant. This was a divine figure coming from another culture, and they associated it and accommodated it and put it into their own religious practices. So this is not the Buddha that's being worshipped as the Buddha. This is a Buddha-like figure that's being incorporated into the entourage of the Queen Mother of the West. And that's common in the mirrors of the time, the decoration on the backs of mirrors of the time, and also on things like the money tree. So as we do get to our meditating Buddha, the 338 Buddha, he does fit into this kind of long stream of a changing approach to the iconography of the human figure in Chinese art. But what's happening in the later part of that iconography is more and more religious figures are being incorporated, worked into the art forms. As we go from this period on, then they become the subjects. This is the subject of Buddhist figures and Buddhist sculpture. This is the subject of massive production from this period on. So it becomes much more important, much more dominant. It plays a dominant role in the arts from this period on, in religious arts, particularly Buddhist religious arts, but in religious arts of all kinds. So you get Taoist figures, you get different kinds of figures being cast in coming up in the sculptural form. So this is an idea that I've been playing with you all made me do this by making this lecture and trying to come up with something new to talk about. So I have some more work to do on this, but I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Where does the 338 Buddha fit in that whole evolution of the human figure? From those early times when the human figure was quite rare, and the main objects being used in religious practices were vessels. They were not sculptural at all. To the point of the 338, and from the 3838 as you go forward, these become the subject of the object of worship. You're worshiping this Buddha. This is a figure then that is a primary figure in the religious practices. So that's quite an evolution, quite a change, and something to look at more closely. Again, I recommend reading the article by Lai Guoguang and others. There are some good people thinking about this kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start this. I think I can get through most of this in the time I have left before we take our break. Another complicated subject, the transmission of Buddhism, the early transmission of Buddhism to China. It wasn't an easy transmission, and we often look at it from the Chinese perspective. Kenneth Chen, in his Buddhism in China historical survey, breaks this kind of transmission down into three parts. The period of preparation, which he dates from 65 to 317 of the Common Era. The period of domestication, which he dates from 317 to 589. So that's where the 338 Buddha fits in the early part of that. The period of acceptance and independent growth, which is from 589 to 900, so from the Sui through basically the end of the Tang. And then the period of appropriation, that's his fourth period. So there's something, of course, difficult about that. That's very good if you're looking at everything from the Chinese perspective, and that's how it worked in China. But there was a lot more going on than that. That period of preparation, of course, that meant there needed to be a need, a desire, some form of interest, a developing interest, and the need for a developing interest in China for a new series of religious practices, an interest in a new series of religious practices. What was that all about? Come on, somebody will help me over here earlier. Oh, now we're yawning. Okay, so the fall of the Han Dynasty, of course, the collapse, the periods that come at the end of the Han Dynasty, brings into question the whole religious structure of that culture. I mean, the mandate of heaven, heaven as the all-powerful being, doing the proper rituals and rites brings about the approval, the mandate, the continuing mandate of heaven, the importance of its messages back and forth to heaven and so on. Well, the mandate is gone. Did the mandate ever exist? The world's in crisis. Things are falling apart. So the Chinese begin to be interested in other kinds of religious practices. And Buddhism offered salvation, in the Pure Land Buddhism, you go to a magical paradise and spend time there. Taoism developing at the same time for some of the same fundamental reasons. Okay, that's good too. That's still from the Chinese point of view. What's missing? Boy, what's missing is those people who brought Buddhism to China. I mean, that's a big part of what was the spread of any religion is the people who brought the religion there. Of course, the people have to be willing and interested to learn it, but somebody's got to be interested and willing to bring it there. And those monks, those traveling monks who brought Buddhism to China, that's a fascinating group of people. We don't talk about them so much from the Chinese perspective because Chinese want to see China as the center of the universe. They've had from day one. So who are these people? They show up a little bit in Chinese history. We know some of the names, but the real study of who those monks were and where they came from, it's all tied up in that marvelous mess that David so likes. Central Asia, the Silk Road, the confusion at the end of the Han Dynasty, and all of that. And I still think I'm going to start off a little bit. So we all know quite a bit about the Silk Road and how it had developed. You know, the main Chinese centers being over in Chang'an and Luoyang, and up to Dunhuang, which was kind of the end of the Chinese side, and across the great deserts of the Taklamakan and the Gobi, over the mountains into areas beyond. That was by and large a mercantile route. If we look at the Silk Roads, we're looking at trade. And interesting as these kinds of trends and studies go along, not so long ago the big thing was to talk about the Sogdians, and we now know that the Sogdians were the main merchants on those routes. They were the ones who owned the camels and kind of maintained the trade routes, did a lot of the trade, and they were way over here in this area. They were traveling all the way across there. So they had set up a kind of a trade route with bringing things back and forth. There's marvelous letters and such. We get a pretty good idea of what their life was like. But the Sogdians were Zoroastrians. They weren't Buddhists. They weren't bringing Buddhism. They didn't have anything to do with Buddhism. There was an attempt to try to link the merchants and the monks. I think that's a little bit of a problem, and I think a number of others are thinking that's a little bit of a problem. Let's go on a little bit more. As we're looking for that reason for Buddhism to come into China and Buddhist imagery to come into China, we have this whole concept of Shangri. That is, we know that in order to maintain the favor of heaven, the mandate of heaven, you have to do the right rituals, to have the proper respect for your elders, and so on and so forth. None of us have those these days, but we did at that time. Well, how did heaven communicate that favor or disfavor with you? And that came through all kinds of auspicious signs. And the Chinese spent enormous amounts of time studying omens and looking at and trying to find auspicious figures and characters, and that shows up in their art form, like this wonderful chariot fitting that Wu Hong wrote his very pivotal article on back in Orientations a long, long time ago. But you see these wonderful representations of exotic animals and such as signs of good fortune and such. So that's part of the acceptance of Buddhism and Buddha-like figures into the Chinese art iconography. It's coming in that form, in figures that are involved in the Shang-Rei kind of Shang-Rei type of beliefs, that whole kind of structure. So there was a ready place for these figures to come, like places for them to show up. Have any of you really looked at this little piece? Good for you. This is in our collection, and since day one, I think, until not so long ago, it was dated Tong. And it's small, it's about 2.5 inches, 3 inches tall. It's a very, very small piece. And I remember Marilyn Rhee came through many years ago and said, no, that's not Tong at all. That's Han, that's Eastern Han. That's 2nd century, and that's really, really important, and you should spend more time and you should publish that piece, and so on and so on and so on. So what makes it Eastern Han? Well, that's difficult. It's a fairly developed kind of iconography. It's stories of the life of the Buddha. So here's the parinirvana, and you've got different aspects of the life of the Buddha. So, how does it get there? Boy, can we shift that over just a little bit? That slide is kind of cut off. Is John here? We've lost John. Oh, you can see most of it. This is a piece that's in the British Museum. It's associated with the Kushan king Kanishka, and so here are Buddhist figures being cast here, and the historical figure is down here. So there's a man named Xu Wenkan in China who's been working on the languages and the whole what's going on in Central Asia, and he's particularly interested in a group called the Yuezhi. Does this name ring any bells with any of you, the Yuezhi? So a little bit of a history lesson here, a quick one. Good boy, some people have read my articles and are way ahead of me. The Yuezhi were people that were on the northwest side of China in the late warring states and into the early part of the Han. And they went into battle with the Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu were successful and drove them into Central Asia and places further beyond. They settled in, around Pakistan, around the area of Gandhara, and they established what was become the Kushan Empire. So the Yuezhi, who had been pushed off the borders of China, ended up establishing the Kushan Empire. And the major king of the Kushan Empire, a major king, was this Kanishka. And he established and then pushed his dynastic reign quite a ways out to where the Kushan Empire actually would have spread. I'm going to go back to this map. Would have spread all the way. This is the Kushan kingdom here, and then actually it spread out a little bit further in influence. So it was on the other end of the Silk Road until the end of the Kushan Empire in the 3rd century. So this was a major center of Buddhist studies. The Kushan, that was a Buddhist kingdom, and Kanishka was Buddhist. And this kind of Buddhist figure is the kind of thing that was being created at his time. And if you look closely, again, this is tiny, tiny, tiny. I think you can begin to pick up, Marilyn Rhee argues quite vehemently, that you're picking up influences from this kind of figure here are beginning to show up in the Buddhist arts of the Eastern Han. And let's take our break now. It's a little early, but we'll come back and finish off that little section, and then we will have a little bit of history and personalities. Thank you.